Copy, Atlas 2-1. You have execute authority.
All teams, we're green. We're green.
3 mics to phase line Alpha. Clock's on.
If we attack now, they will kill the Prime Minister.
They'll kill him anyway. We'll get him out alive.
Keep it tight.
Welcome fellow gamers to a first in one of my many new sections or themes I am introducing and segmenting formats for this year. These sections will be where I get technical on various aspects of video game development, techniques, hardware and all things binary. And they're going to be entitled Technobabble, explaining the science behind the wows. My aim is to try and advise, educate and hopefully demystify some of the areas of how these machines we play on are made, used and ultimately how developers, all the clever people that work on these day to day, work out how to maximise and deliver the experiences we all take for granted. But be careful, these will be tech heavy and some may find themselves getting lost or confused. So I will do my best to simplify, but success is never guaranteed and more than one view may be needed. So with that intro done, let's get started. First up is the subject of the now-gen console machines, the Xbox One and the PS4, and as my title suggests, are they just low mid-range PCs in a small box? Well, this is a question I will answer finally by the end of this video, but first I need to explain a few things that some may already know or not. Spurred on by the recent software development leak of the Xbox One dev kit and accompanying e-help guide, I think now is a good time to delve into this, and as I have seen many, shall we say, hopeful articles and reaching on such, I think it will hopefully help many people out. Let's start with the basic hardware in each of these consoles, and in the green corner we have the Xbox One, which inside its lovely shiny plastic housing it contains a simple SoC, which is basically a system on a chip design that is housed on a standard PCB motherboard. One AMD x86-64 28nm semi-custom APU. This is an 8-core CPU split into 2 modules that each 4 cores share the same L2 2MB cache. It runs at a base and constant clock speed of 1.75 GHz. Each Jaguar core has a 32KB 2-way L1 instruction or input cache and a 32KB 8-way L1 data cache, so as to operate with each individual core. On top of that, each module has a 2MB shared L2 data cache they split between the 4 cores, giving around 512KB per core in operation cycles. These are then feeding or reading into a shared pool of 8GB of DDR3 running at 2133 MHz, which is split around the chip on the board into chunks of 512 MB of 16, giving the total bandwidth limit 68 GB per second non-coherent and 30 GB per second coherent. Bear in mind this is read and write and can be split between read or write as the application needs, but this is the maximum limit and no different to any other quoted figure from the PS4 or PC GPUs or CPUs, etc. To clarify, it means that if an app is writing 30 GB per second, then it can also read at 38 GB per second, or combinations thereof. Please bear in mind that all of these figures are a theoretical total, and like always, mileage may vary and it never works out the same way on paper as it does in real life, but it is well within the normal range of operation expectations. We then get to the meat of the systems, and this is the GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit, which takes up the lion's share of the die. This is the wafer space the entire chip is built on, and this is what is used to generate not only the visuals but other aspects of the game world, and this will increase this generation. The GPU in question is comprised of 12 CUs, or compute units, that make up a total of 768 shader processor units, or ALUs. As you may have seen them more commonly referenced, which means arithmetic logic unit, and these are the little guys who do all the clever math. Think of them as CPU cores, not as clever, but brute force teamwork. Each of the 12 compute units has a 64KB LDS local data storage that is also used to hold information as they work and can be cleverly used, which I will touch on in a later video. It also has an L2 cache of 512KB, which averages out around 128KB across each 3 cores. This can be divvied up however the developer chooses. On top of this, it has 48 TMUs, or texture mapping units, which I will cover again in a later video. We have to pick our battles here. All fired out with 16 ROPs, raster operation pipelines, or even more widely known as render output unit, where pixels, colours, textures and all input calculations done throughout the pipe are blended here into the final output image we all see on screen, all running at 853 MHz. The machine also has 4 DMAs, or direct memory access engines, that help manage data moves to free up time cycles from the CPU, along with some other niceties like hardware compression and decompression and swizzle. Nothing new here, but they are helpful to maximise performance, including the DDR RAM and one more specific entry, not leaving out the 32 MB of fast SRAM on the board that is split into 4 chunks of 8, with a data width of 256 bits. The SRAM is needed as it improves the speed of system bandwidth immensely up to the levels needed for today's high quality visuals at high resolutions, see pixel fill rate, while also being a decision needed as the choice of DDR3 over the PS4's much faster DDR5 or GDDR5 would have left the Xbox One severely handicapped. But with the SRAM, developers have an extremely fast, if small, scratch pad to work in. This is totally dedicated to the GPU and cannot be used by the CPU. How they use this will certainly change and adapt over time, both from them and Microsoft allowing changes to things, which I'll touch on a little later in the video. Along with this, it has a few custom chips on the board to help out with sound processing, along with a secondary stash of 8 GB of flash RAM. Doesn't take a rocket science to work out this matches the system RAM and is most likely used completely for the system sleep and resume state. Now we hit the other machine, this time Sony's PS4, and although they have been far more secretive on the innards and schematic architecture that makes up their machine, we still have quite a good picture on how it works. But let's go through the hardware. Much like the Xbox One, it runs from a SoC system, again from AMD with a few custom changes, but it is based on a pretty much identical x86-64 Jaguar CPU of 8 cores split into 2 blocks of 4 with 2 meg cache. In fact, all the same except that Sony run the CPU at 1.6 GHz, 175 MHz slower than the Xbox One, which in turn means all the rates of the system are slightly slower, but to the same level as the minor CPU increase. The GPU is again AMD with 18 compute units, 1152 shaders or ARUs, with 72 TMUs and 32 ROPs, but it runs at 800 MHz. They are both fed and feed again on 8 gigs of GDDR5 pool of unified RAM, split into this time 16 chunks of 512 again, with 8 on the top and 8 on the bottom of the board surrounding the APU. This offers up a peak bandwidth of 176 GB per second while running at 5500 MHz. Again, like the Xbox One, it has custom chips to help with sound, including an ARM chip currently used for managing background tasks, downloading, etc. In a secondary twist, it also has its own little block of 2 gigabits of DDR3. Now, not to be confused with gigabytes, this is actually only 256 megabytes of RAM. This feeds the ARM processor all on its own. On top of this, it also has a secondary 256 megabytes of flash RAM. Again, like on the Xbox One, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that the DDR is there to feed the ARM chip, which is currently only used for background downloading, and then the actual flash RAM is most likely used for when you're doing firmware updates on the BIOS and stuff. But to put it into a little bit of perspective, the 256 megabytes of RAM feeding the secondary ARM chip is the same amount of RAM available to the PS3's GPU back in the day. Oh well, things move on. Now, both machines are designed with two very simple things in mind. They're designed to be run all of the time and be on all of the time, and they're also designed to do more than just play games, and that's essentially what they do. So power usage and low power states are a big thing of this generation, and the ARM processor in the PS4 is going to help it out. But essentially, if you look at both of these machines side by side, the first thing you can tell without a shadow of a doubt is that Sony is first and foremost a hardware company and Microsoft is first and foremost a software company. Now, the PS4 on paper has a more powerful GPU to around 50%. But don't get too hung up on that, a lot of people do, don't worry about that too much. It certainly is more powerful, but more impressively is the size of the unit. Not only is it around half the size of the Xbox One, but it also contains an internal PSU, the power supply unit, and the Xbox One has an external one, just like the 360. With that aside, they both have a very similar TDP target, thermal design power. This is the aim or the design of the machines to run apps all day, every day, and the heat migration or the heat dissipation is set up to manage that for long periods of time in real world situations, and they do it exceptionally well. The PS4 is certainly slightly noisier than the Xbox One. That said, the PS4 and the Xbox One aren't really that noisy except when installing games from the disc, and that's very short-lived. They're a hell of a lot quieter than PCs I work with generally day to day. Now, with all that out of the way and all the hardware out of the way, we move on to the far more important software side, relatively speaking. Now, here to get some of the other crazy theories across the internet, the first up is the Xbox One running its 3 amazing operating systems. Now, I'll let you into a little secret here, it's not really that new, and it never really has been. Anyone who's worked in business or at least IT for the past 10 plus years or so knows that virtualization is pretty much where everything's gone. Years ago, you had to buy a physical unit to run a DC or a domain controller. You'd stick it in a rack. If you wanted an exchange or mail server, you'd buy another unit, a web server, another unit, and so on and so forth. All of these would become far more power hungry, not to mention the rack space. Now, all of this has changed, and at this point you're probably thinking, what am I going on about? Well, there's a method to my madness. gives you a bit of insight and a good base. Now quite a few years ago all of this changed and got moved into one single, or more if needed, device. And all you had to do was then move all of these physical units, the BIOS, the hardware, into actual virtual files somewhere else on a drive or a SAN. This is called encapsulation. At this point, the network technician can then decide where they're going to allocate this hardware across one or many different iterations of servers. This could be one single server, this could be a server for Exchange, a database server, a web server, and so on and so forth. And this basically runs across two main contenders, be them VMware and Microsoft Hyper-V. Now there is subtle differences to both of them, but they work pretty much the same to not be worried about in this conversation. They both use the process of encapsulation, like I've said, and this is virtualization as we know it. This hardware is split and managed through something called a hypervisor across both, and this is essentially how the Xbox One and the PS4 is working. Now this isn't new even in the console space. Both the Xbox 360 and the PS3 always use the hypervisor as well. As I say, this is not new technology. The big thing about hypervisor, and the biggest thing they've both changed this generation I'm absolutely sure of, is it handles the security very, very well. It means that even if you manage to hack the operating system and get something to run, the hypervisor would see that it was an unregistered and unlicensed bit of software, it would kill it dead and turn it off. This means that the game can actually crash and you don't actually have the console crashing out. You can then resume back to the desktop, restart the game and load it back in. They run completely and utterly autonomously. And this security abstraction layer is a very key ingredient to how these both consoles work. It means they can do things dynamically as we work through this generation, and one of the lessons that Sony learned pretty hard last time was the rule of thumb is always, you can always give back, you can never take away. By having this split of hypervisor, it means that the game doesn't need to worry about what's been allocated, it can all be handled separately. Now at this point, or when the consoles launched, the Xbox One launched with an operating system that had 3 gigs of RAM available to it, that's gigabytes, and 2 cores of the CPU, and around 10% of the GPU. That also includes some bandwidth on the system. Now, even though this is a hypervisor I'm talking about, the actual functionality that they use will be very different to a hypervisor in its actual implementation, but the entire process and everything else is pretty much identical to how it works. It's just far more robust and very hand-tailored. Now when the PS4 launched, they had 3.5 gig allocated to the operating system, again the 2 cores, and even though it wasn't publicised, I'm sure a small percentage of GPU space and bandwidth was also taken, although no way would it be anything like the Kinect on the Xbox One. So games like Killzone, Shadowfall and Second Son all only ran with 4.5 gig available to the game, of which 3 gig was running for the visuals and the rest was game code. And this would have carried over to all of the launch games at the time like Battlefield 4, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, etc, etc. This has already increased this year, with games on the PS4 now having the 5 gig available to them just like the Xbox One. And currently where we sit, the PS4 and the Xbox One have an identical allocation of 6 cores, 5 gig of RAM and whatever is left on the GPU. With the Kinect 2 pretty much being dead on arrival, not helped very much by Microsoft not giving any games for it, this means they can now give back some of this to the developers, and they've already started doing this. As of October last year, the software development kit had an update to allow a percentage of a 7th core given back to developers. This means that they can have a maximum of 80% of that CPU available to them with a minimum of 50%. Now at this point I doubt any game that's launched is using this update, as it was so close to the end of launch time over Christmas. I don't think anyone's going to take the risk, even though the October dash would have had this update. Because there's no notification in the system at this point, you don't know you're going to lose that 30%, and having no guarantees is never a great place to be. But it's already documented and obviously very clear that Microsoft will get round to telling developers when this is going to be lost, just like they do when they go into constrained mode or snapped mode. Now when this does, developers will have the choice of using this 50 to 80% when they need to, but I see this being a moving target. And I see throughout this year that 1 reserve core being given back fully to developers, and the 3 gig reservation of memory being slashed in half. And I see the PS4 completely following suit. And in these systems, every little bit helps. Now the GPU allocation on the Xbox One has also changed. With the reserves for the natural user interface being dropped, it means they can now take back 4.5% of this GPU allocation back to the system, and about 1 GB of bandwidth. This was an effect from earlier last year, along with the dropping of DX11 standard driver, which most of the launch games shipped with. Now this obviously explains, as I said before in previous videos, why the Xbox One seems so massively out of place with the PS4. This doesn't mean that Sony were ready to ship and completely finished, because they weren't, but the development environment was far better with a much easier and more powerful system. This was the reason why you saw such a disparity of 720 1080. But nothing stays static, and as we can see, Sony and Microsoft are both making strides in adding more functionality to developers across both systems, but there is vast amount of things that are going to change over the next 12 months and beyond. One of those main functionalities is using the GPU, like I've said before, and obviously the CPU more effectively, but I have to keep this video to a minimal. One of the areas I'm going to touch on in further videos is the difference between Intel and AMD CPUs, and how the advantage of something like an i7, even if you could stick it in a console, is not as simple as you think. The consoles do not need that kind of power, and they work completely differently, but as I say, it is for another video another time. The disparity between Intel and AMD is a big conversational piece that hopefully people will enjoy when I go through that in the video. Suffice to say, within the aim and budget and target they had, they both did exceptionally well, with very similar machines being shipped. The cost difference here is they are shipping these machines and making a profit so long as you buy a game or two, which is probably everyone does, from day one, which is not how previous console generations have worked out. The great misconception is the majority of PC gamers do not have a machine that runs at the level of an Xbox One, even on paper, let alone how it achieves in the real world situation. But again, that is a conversation for another video. This is going to drag on for just too long. The other area where the Xbox One received some criticism was in the 32 meg of SRAM on the chip, which this is needed, as I said earlier, due to the GDDR5 solution that the PS4 took. Now, it isn't such a bigger problem, and certainly isn't as complicated as developers everyone makes out, because they're used to it with the Xbox 360 solution that had a very similar process in place anyway. And also on top of that, Microsoft will make it a hell of a lot easier to use due to the fact that they'll fit it inside the API, so the developer doesn't need to choose, or at least has the option to use it as best they see fit. One of the changes that's happened in a recent update is the fact you can now split the actual resolution or render targets for the screen down into sections. Here you can see an example from the SDK kit where you see this portion in green is only occupied in the SRAM. The 20% at the top is in the DDR3 and the 10% at the bottom is in the DDR3. Now this section or dissection of the screen and the render target can be done as you see fit. This means that developers can use that fast RAM for all of the key areas of the game and use the lower end of the RAM for different areas. This could be for simple things like cube maps or skyboxes in the clouds, which don't need to be accessed as regularly or as fast as what is needed from something like the SRAM or GDDR5. On top of this, like I say, the improvements will also work out in the GPU compute using asynchronous. Here's an example from a PS4 presentation back in 2013. No point in reinventing the wheel here, but you can see the section that is blue is GPU render time. The sections that is completely transparent is not being used at all, and these are the 18 cores of the compute units available on the GPU. This has then been filled in by compute work. These are the red and yellow and green areas in the gaps. And this is one of the special features of these console generations. Because this functionality is designed from the ground up to be part of what they do, certainly on the PS4, with it being HSA compliant, or at least having heterogeneous memory structure, means the GPU can snoop the CPU cache, and they can both work and bypass their own caches and work directly with system RAM. But this is going to create a lot of confusion and won't work all of the time, not only for simple reasons like contention issues, but also because it won't work for every functionality. Another area I've seen people get confused by, and I don't think there's any mystery here, but in the actual guide it does show that the Xbox One has two graphic command process units to the same GPU. Contrary to popular belief, this isn't some stacked discrete GPU or hidden GPU, but this is more likely to be the fact that the operating system has its own render cores, therefore it needs to make sure that it doesn't take priority over the application, or at least the exclusive one, which is the game, so therefore they can be split and the game takes priority. All of your snap functionality and on-screen displays don't come for free, and this is exactly the same on the PS4, which also has a split GCP processor which also runs compute through. These are the splits with the dedicated command processor for graphics, one able to handle 3D functionality as well, i.e. the OS. This is then compounded by the fact that it's not mentioned in the guide at all for the developers because it's completely transparent to them. They'll have no access to it. They only have one graphics command processor available to them to the call, and that's the one they work with. On top of this, they've also got the 16 queues available for compute work, which they can use to set up asynchronous work on the compute queues, so that when the render pipe is free, just like the PS4 example, they can use those as well. With the PS4 able to process up to 64 of compute work, it just shows how much Sony think this is something, or at least Mark Cerny thought this was something that was definitely going to be a big thing this generation. And you know what? I think he's onto something. Anyway, as always, I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this, and if you did, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps me immensely. Hope it wasn't too technically waffly for you, and I do try to keep it as simple as possible. This video was just the basis to give you an idea of where these consoles sit, and obviously it gives you an answer behind the fact, are these consoles just like PCs? And the answer is no, they're not. They're just like the consoles of previous generations, a closed box with separate aims, separate architectures, and people being able to work specifically on those benefits and tailor their software as needed. And on top of this, I still see the hardware allocation being changed as well, with probably around 1.5 gig ending up being, or maybe even less, allocated to the operating system, and that last CPU core being a dynamic allocation also, giving as much back to the developers as possible. To give you an example of the restrictions that are on PC that aren't on consoles, as just an aside, DirectX 11 itself and 12, along with the API drivers of the graphics cards, all being restricted by AMD and Nvidia respectively. Far Cry 4 launched on consoles this year and used a special HRAA anti-aliasing solution, hybrid reconstruction anti-aliasing. This operation was not possible on a PC no matter which graphics card you ran, because the developers do not have that level of access to the hardware. I'll have some more technobabble videos up very soon, obviously looking at DirectX 12, which will be out sometime later this year or possibly next. Also going to be hitting the Xbox One with some of the stuff available now, like descriptor tables to minimise CPU usage. This week we've got the Microsoft Windows 10 presentation coming up. Looking forward to what's going to be announced. My surefire bets are obviously the Xbox Live Marketplace being stuck on PC, cross-play functionality on some games, and I would imagine some kind of remote play like you see on the PS4 available on PC. And maybe even the other way around on Xbox One. On Microsoft looking at Steam. The most important thing about all this techno information and hardware I've just been talking about, it doesn't really matter if you've got nothing else to play on it. And as I always keep saying, only the games really matter. I'll see you soon on the next one.